It's not just trauma affects your mind is the point. It's that trauma affects your body. Trauma affects your energy. Trauma affects all of you. And it puts you in this state of shock where you're just frozen. I just finished reading Peter Levine's autobiography called An Autobiography of Trauma. A very interesting, excellent book that I really enjoyed. One of the things that he does in the book that captured my attention was he talks about how the Portuguese use different words for trauma. And he uses two of the Portuguese words for trauma. And so I decided to look into it, and I found out that the Portuguese use three words for trauma. And it was fascinating to me and I want to talk about it, because they just bring out the different aspects of trauma and healing trauma that fill out an understanding of trauma and its nuances. And I just think it really helps us get to a clear perspective on what we're looking at when we talk about trauma. So their first word is trauma. Don't know if I'm saying it right, but it's our word trauma. And it's kind of a more clinical medical diagnosis of somebody that's showing signs of PTSD. So that's kind of the one word used in that setting. But then there's, maybe butchering these words, but ferida. And it's more of what's going on inside. And so it's used in therapeutic and spiritual communities to talk about childhood wounds, generational pain or trauma, emotional neglect, heartbreak, shame, identity, wounding, all of that. And so when you take those two words together, they use the word trauma in that clinical setting, it's, okay, what do we need to do to help this person with their PTSD symptoms? But when it comes to ferida, it means, what do we need to tend to help them heal? What wounds do we need to take care of to nurture? How do we help their soul right now? And so they have a saying that says we need to tend to the wounds so that the trauma doesn't repeat. So I thought that was so insightful. Then they have a third word, susto. And susto, roughly translated, means fright paralysis. So it's a condition where a person is so overwhelmed by shock or fear that their body and spirit feel immobilized, frozen. And so Peter Levine learned from the indigenous populations and rural communities that they use this term to convey an embodied sense of trauma, where your body and energy literally freeze. And so it's not just trauma affects your mind is the point. It's that trauma affects your body, trauma affects your energy, trauma affects all of you. And it puts you in this state of shock where you're just frozen. But then, as Levine talked more and more about it with the leaders, one of the tribal leaders told him that trauma isn't just an individual issue, but it's a breakdown of the fabric of society. And I thought that was just brilliant. And so if you look at the first word, trauma, it's kind of the symptoms that are happening of PTSD. Ferida, there's a wound here. Now you get to susto, and it's this wound is affecting them, but that's partly because they didn't have people to connect to. They didn't have people who would meet their needs. And so what they're recognizing is that it's not the event that caused the trauma. It's the fact that when that event happened, which was scary, they didn't have anybody to run to, anybody who would be there for them, anybody to connect to, anybody that would meet their needs. That's why the trauma took place. And so, therefore, when it comes to healing, healing isn't something you do on your own. It's not isolated. It includes the whole community coming together through rituals, community gathering, music, dance, collective reconnection to reweave together the lack of bond that the trauma exposed. And to me, that is just so brilliant. You got those three different words that look at it from here's the symptoms, here's the wound, but there's a community aspect as well. And so there needs to be a community that comes together to help. So that's why Peter Levine came up with the saying, trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. So it's because we have nobody there to help us. The essence of trauma is disconnection from ourselves. And then others have taken the phrase, Gabor Mate's made it famous, trauma is not what happens to you, the event. Trauma is what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. And what we're seeing is the reason it happens inside you is because you couldn't connect to somebody. So let me give you a couple other bits of research over the years. So way back in 1899, a French psychologist, Pierre Janet, observed that what defined a traumatic experience wasn't the severity of the event. So it wasn't a car accident or a rape or whatever. It's not the severity of the event, but how that event affected the mind. It's the state, the vulnerability of the person. That's what causes the trauma. And so in his 1899 book, L'Autisme psychologique, Janet wrote that the trauma was not the event itself, but the reaction of the individual, meaning that the trauma cannot be determined by some external measure of severity. That's the key point. But rather, it's a measure of how the nervous system of the individual responds to the event. And what determines how that individual's nervous system responds to the event is whether or not anybody was there for them, whether or not they were connected to safe, strong people who could meet their needs and help them. So that leads to understanding that severe external events, they can cause trauma in one person, but doesn't seem to affect the other person. So you go, okay, it's not the external event. So why does it cause trauma in one and not the other? Because of what's going on inside them, and that's determined by, do they have connection? And I think this is why I want to emphasize this, is because I think so much of people understanding of trauma, as I do seminars all over, is they still think of trauma as the severity of an event. That's their focus. That's kind of how they understand trauma. So severe event, oh, that causes trauma. Not severe doesn't cause trauma. And it's missing the main point. So all children go through painful events, but some children end up with trauma, some don't. So it's not the severity of the event that's the issue. That's part of the equation, no denying that. The key piece was their connection, was their secure attachment to a regulated, safe adult who had tools, who was there to support them and teach them. Then the child's nervous system wouldn't be overwhelmed. But if there's not secure attachment, then the child's system is overwhelmed and it results in trauma. But I got to take this a step further. You see, got to go back. In understanding complex trauma, I want you to now see there's going to be two layers of trauma. So understanding complex trauma is really about a child trying to attach securely to parents who aren't able to attach securely. They're too busy, they got their own problems, they're angry, they're stressed out, and so the child cannot form secure attachment. The result of that is they feel all alone against a big bad world, they feel rejected, they feel not good enough, and that's trauma. That's complex trauma. That seems very subtle, and it is, but yet it's that deep inside, the child is feeling overwhelmed. This is too much, and they have trauma. So that's trauma one. That starts very early, usually in a child's life. Then you come to these scary, big events, and the child is already not feeling connected. And so the event now overwhelms them. And so trauma is piled upon this pre-existing complex trauma. And I think that just to me gives such an important perspective on understanding trauma. So bottom line, trauma begins with the lack of connection. That is fundamental in understanding trauma. You've got to understand this whole primacy of the connection piece. So, got to take it farther. That means healing from trauma. And this is what the Portuguese understood. The healing from trauma is about connection. It has to include connection. It's not just about information. It's not just about doing and implementing certain tools on your own. It's about reconnecting. That then begins to heal the wound. So, just to pull this all together, trauma is not just something in the mind. It's somatic. That's what Peter Levine saw through all the different words. But it's also attachment. It's community-based. And so in coming to heal, you have to teach. You have to do somatic stuff to unblock all of the trauma stored in the body and release it. And then you gotta reconnect. And so Western approaches to trauma is what I want you to see. Often just focus on the intellectual learning piece. What these words show is that there's two other pieces that we have to include in trauma healing. There's got to be facing the body, helping the body release the trauma, and then there's got to be connection. So, one final thing. Connection is not just important when it comes to trauma. Connection is important when it comes to just understanding what does a healthy life look like. Connection is not just something that a child needed and then you don't need it come to adult life because you're supposedly independent. Connection is something that we need through all of life. And so I am so glad for the work that's being done in this whole area of attachment. It's really putting on the radar and showing the priority of healthy attachment. And I think for years it's been minimized. Oh, you don't need it. Everybody wants to be independent. You can do stuff on your own. You can heal on your own. No, you can't. Healthy attachment is central to healing and it's central to a healthy life.